Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to solve a quadratic by completing the square. And that will be our learning target. We're really focused once again here on these last three and how to solve quadratics, square roots, completing the square, and then using the quadratic formula. Once again, a reminder that we're really just trying to find those x-intercepts. In other words, where it crosses the x-axis, those are our solutions. So again, that's what we're trying to find. Completing the square, what is it? It's a method used to change a quadratic into something called a perfect square trinomial. In order to do this, you have the x squared term and the bx term together, and in order to make this a perfect square trinomial, you take half of b, so it says b over 2 squared. So really, what does that mean? Well, it's going to be, b in this case is 16, so I'm going to say 16 divided by 2 squared. Now you can do this in your head. You can simplify this, but really you're going to say, well, 16 divided by 2 is 8, and then you're going to square that. So that would give me 64. Now, whenever you square something, it's always positive, so this will always be plus, and now 64. Okay, this is called a perfect square trinomial. And we're going to kind of talk about why that is here. Let's factor this now. So we just learned how to factor. Notice the leading coefficient here is 1. So I'm going to say two numbers that multiply to be 64, but add up to be 16. Well, that would be 8 and 8. This is called a perfect square trinomial because this and this are the same when you factor it. Notice x plus 8, x plus 8. So we write that those are both binomials. So to write it as a binomial squared, since they're the same, you could say this is x plus 8 squared. Okay? So this and this, these two things are the exact same thing. If you took and multiplied this out, you would end up with x squared plus 16x plus 64. Now, one thing you might notice is this right here is 16. Well, this, when you factor it, is 8. It's half of that. So that, or this number right here. So that's something to keep in mind. You'll notice that might be a shortcut to get to the binomial squared version or the factored form. So why again is this called completing the square? Well, this might help you. If not, that's okay. Here's another way to look at this. So these are algebra tiles. And in this one, I have x squared plus 16x. Well, this is a algebra. This square here is a tile. That's the sides are x times x. So that would give me an area of x squared. These tiles down here at the bottom, one side is 1 and the other side is x. So this would just give us 1 times x is x. So each of these are x. Notice those. Okay, so that, notice there's 6 of the smaller ones, which is where we get this, and then the x squared. So that's x squared plus 6x represented in algebra tiles. Well, it's called completing the square because if I take half of 6 and I square it, I get 3 squared or 9. Now notice if I add 9 of these are 1 by 1s, so these are each 1. There's 9 little tiles here. It's called completing the square because it makes a perfect square now if I add those together. Well, that's why it's called completing the square. It also makes it a perfect square trinomial, meaning if you put them all together, it forms a square. Okay, so how do we do this? We just kind of talked about that. To complete the square, you're going to use b over 2 squared. Now you can do this in your head a lot of times. So you might say, well, for part A, what is my b value? It's 7. So I might say, all right, 7 divided by, well, I guess 14 divided by 2, and that is 7. And then you're going to square that. Okay, so that would be 49. And again, it's always going to be positive. Whenever you square something, it should be positive. So this would be a perfect square trinomial. When you factor it, two numbers that multiply to be 49 but add up to be 14 will be positive 7 and positive 7. It asks us to then write it as a binomial squared. So I need to write this as x plus 7 squared. Now once again, you can go right from here to here by just taking, this number will be half of that b value. So that's one way you could get there a little faster. So we'll kind of show you that with this next one. Okay, so here in this particular one, we want to say, all right, notice there's a negative 20 here. So we're going to say negative 20 divided by 2 squared. So that's negative 10. You want to keep that in parentheses and square it. If you don't keep it in parentheses, you're going to get negative 100, which negative 10 times negative 10 is positive 100. Again, anytime you square something, it should be positive. So this is positive 100 is going to go here. So I'm going to say plus 100. This makes this a perfect square trinomial. Again, if you factor this, two numbers that multiply to be positive 100 but add up to be negative 20 would be negative 10 and negative 10. So this would be x minus 10 squared. And once again, you could go directly to there, and we'll do that with this last one. Okay, let's try this last one. So let's see. We've got negative 12 divided by 2 squared. So that'd be negative 6 squared, which is 36. And again, if you could do that in your head, great. And then you're going to factor it. And this time I'm just going to go directly to the binomial squared. So this should be x minus 6. Notice that this is a minus. This was a minus. Be careful. Make sure those things match. Okay, and that is really what I need to write for this, is to complete the square and then write it as a binomial square. Okay. All right. So how do we complete the square? Well, we've talked a little bit about this. We know how to complete the square, but how do we solve by completing the square? Well, first, you want to make sure the x squared term and the x term are by themselves first. So you have to get the c on the other side. Then you're going to divide the entire equation by, if there's a number in front of the x squared, you're going to need to divide the entire equation by a. Now, so this only applies if the a is something other than 1, okay? So keep that in mind. This may be a step you might not need to do. Then step 3, you're going to take half of b, square it, and add it. Now, because it will now be an equation, you'll need to add it to both sides. And you'll see what I mean here in a second. Then you will factor it. You should be able to then write it as a binomial squared. And you'll write it as x plus something quantity squared, or maybe x minus something squared. And then you're going to solve. You'll need to get rid of that squaring, so you'll take the square root of both sides, and we'll go from there to solve for x. All right, so how does this work? What does this look like? Let's try it. Okay, solve by completing the square. All right, so we are going to, step 1, it says to move the c to the right side. So I need my c value in this case here is that. So I'm going to get that to the other side. So I'm just going to start by subtracting 20. Okay, we have x squared plus 12x. These cancel out. Now I'm going to have to complete the square. So I'm going to actually leave a space there because I'll want to complete the square. Now when I complete the square, I'm also going to have to add that same thing on the other side. So keep that in mind. That's why I like to draw the blank on both sides so I don't forget. So now I'm going to complete the square. Okay. Now notice this one, step 2, says to divide the entire equation by a. I don't have something, it's 1 here, so I don't need to do that. But if it was something other than 1, I would have to. Okay. So I'm good. Step 2 is good. So step 3, half of b squared, and add it to both sides. So I'm going to say this is 12 divided by 2 squared, which is going to give me 6 squared, or 36. So I'm going to say plus 36, plus 36. Okay. Notice I added it to both sides. Don't forget that part. Now you're going to factor the trinomial that you created. That's the perfect square trinomial. And then write your answer as x plus something squared. So when I factor this side, I know it's going to be x plus, it's going to be the same thing. So the binomial will be the same. So I'm going to use the shortcut version. This would be x plus 6 times x plus 6, or x plus 6 squared. And then this side over here, we're just going to say, what is negative 20 plus 36? And that would give me 16. Okay. All right, now I want to solve for x. This means I need to get rid of that squaring. So as you can see here, step 5 says to then take the square root of both sides and solve for x. Okay, so I'm going to square root this, and I'm going to square root this. All right, so now when I square root that, the squaring and the square root are going to cancel out. So I'm going to be left with x plus 6. Because I just have just those two things, I don't need the parentheses anymore. And then over here, I'm going to have the square root of 16, but I'm going to remember that I have two answers when I do that. It's plus or minus 4, okay? Cool. Now, next I want to solve for x, so I'm going to subtract 6, and I'm going to subtract 6. Now notice I put it kind of in front of this here. I kind of lined it up with that. And so here's how we'll write this. This is x equals, and now when I write this, I'm going to write negative 6 in front of the plus or minus. So it's negative 6 plus or minus 4. And then I'm just going to figure out what are those two answers. So I should have two answers. Let's figure them out. So I have negative 6. You could write this step or you could not. It's up to you. You can just do this in your head, but I'm going to write it for this one, so you can see what I'm doing. So my two answers are really negative 6 plus 4, which is negative 2. And my other answer would be negative 6 minus 4, which is negative 10. Okay, so what does this mean? These are my two answers. I've just solved this quadratic by completing the square. What this means is this graph would cross the x-axis at negative 2 and negative 10. Okay, so that's how you solve by completing the square. That's how you can solve a quadratic. Okay, so we're going to try a couple other ones here. Just make sure we got this. All right, so same things. I'm going to move this c to the other side. Now notice I have, in this particular case, I have, again, a leading coefficient of 1. So I'm going to move this c to the other side. So that means add 3 to both sides. I get x squared minus 8x. This is gonna cancel out. I'm gonna leave that space there. This is 1. And then I'm also gonna add that same thing over here. Okay, now again, step 2, we can skip on this one because our a is 1. So I'm gonna do half of b, negative 8 divided by 2, and square it. Okay, that's negative 4. Negative 4 squared is 16. Again, it's anytime you square it, it's always positive. Okay, so then I'm going to write this in the factored form now on the left. So I'm going to factor this. There's a negative here, so be careful. This will be x minus 4 quantity squared. Again, this number should always be half of that number, right? Negative 8, half of that, negative 4. Okay, so x minus 4 squared equals 17. Okay, now I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Okay, and this is going to give me just x minus 4 equals, the square root of 17 is not super nice. I know I should have two answers, but let's see what that is. Okay, so square root of 17. Now we're going to round our answers to the nearest hundredth, so I'm going to go 2 decimal places. That is 4.12. So that's what I'm going to write. But I'm going to write plus or minus 4.12. Okay, now I'm going to add 4, and I'm going to add 4. And again, you're going to end up writing this in front of that. So this would be x equals 4 plus or minus 4.12. Okay, so now my two answers, I'm just going to do this one. 4 plus 4.12 would be 8.12. And then my other one would be 4 minus 4.12, which would be negative 0.12. Again, type it into your calculator if you're not sure, but those would be my two answers. Now, these are not as nice answers, right? And so here's where completing the square kind of helps. If you were graphing this, you would not be able to get quite as exact. Okay, we're going to do one more that has an a value in front of it so that you see how that works. Okay, so still, step one is to move the a value to the other side. Notice there's a number here, again, just like the last one. Don't worry about that, that's okay. So I'm going to go plus 10. Okay, so we get 3x squared minus 18x equals 54. Now, before I can complete the square, I have to get rid of that leading coefficient. It has to be a 1. So we're going to divide everything by 3 to get rid of that. Okay, now when you divide by 3, you're dividing both of these terms by 3, so don't forget that. So this will give me x squared minus 6x. Now I'm going to put a blank here because I'm going to complete the square here. And then 54 divided by 3 is 18. Okay? And I'm going to put a blank on that other side so I can complete the square. So now you're going to look here to do your half of b, right? So this is negative 6 divided by 2 squared. That would be negative 3 squared, which is 9. Okay? So I'm going to write plus 9. Plus 9. Okay, both sides. Now I'm going to factor. Again, be careful here that you don't forget that minus 3. Okay, so it's x minus 3 squared, and then this would be 27. Okay, take the square root. So we're going to do that of both sides. And then I have x minus 3 equals, and I'm going to figure out what the square root of 27 is. So that's not a real nice number. So we're going to do this again here, square root of 27. Press enter. So I get 5.196. So this means I'm going to round this to 5.20. Okay, so again, that next one is a 6, so I'm going to round up. So this would be 5 plus or minus 5.20. Okay, and now we're going to add 3. Add 3. These cancel. I get 3 plus or minus 5.20. And we're going to then write our two answers. Okay, so our first one would be 3 plus 5.20 would be 8.20. And the second one would be 3 minus 5.20. And if you're not sure, you can do that, right? 3 minus 5.20 is negative 2.20. Now we're going to write that extra 0 because it's rounding to the nearest hundredth, so we want to say that it's been rounded. That's indicating that. Okay, so those are my two answers, and that is how you complete the square. Hopefully that makes sense. Here's your assignment. Write it into your plan book and check it off once you've turned it in.